Okay, so welcome everybody to our next chapter in Jewish history. I know that we also have some people coming for the first time as sort of a standalone class, but just to frame this class as sort of a continuation of our trek through Jewish history. So last week we discussed the Enlightenment, which is crucial background to really understanding Zionism as a distinct movement in Jewish history. And we'll try to tackle this from as many different perspectives as possible. I will try to be as objective as possible, but obviously with anything political, that's probably to some extent impossible. But just to do a brief review of everything we did last week, and then we will trek forward into modern Zionism. So we discussed last week, the 1800s was, of course, a huge turning point in Jewish history.
Hey, Tony, I don't have any sound. Can you come help?
Specifically in Europe.
We heard you, Esther.
One of the reasons why, sorry, are we good with sound here?
We're fine. Esther didn't have audio. She's having Tony fix.
Perfect. Okay. So one of the things that we discussed in terms of the Enlightenment last week was there was sort of two different things happened one after another that led to the creation of new ways of understanding Judaism and new Jewish movements. And so the first one was more of a general European phenomenon, which was the Enlightenment in general. So the introduction of secular ideas and rationalization and the decreasing power of religion over the public sphere. And this is something that, of course, the Jewish community was well embellished in. And this is a lot of what we discussed last week in terms of new ways of understanding Judaism, more liberal forms. This, of course, gave birth to the Reform movement and conservative movement and what we know today to be the Orthodox movement. And the other question, which we'll focus a lot more on today, was what we deemed the Jewish question, which was a problem that the Jewish community was dealing with. And I'll introduce this in more length once we get to the sources, but just to sort of give the bird's eye overview before we get into specifics. In the late 1700s in France, and then throughout the 1800s in the rest of Western Europe, one by one, all legal distinctions were lifted off of Jews. And so if we think of Europe for Jews in the Middle Ages, it was a time of enforced legal segregation and a time of state-sponsored anti-Semitism and certain things that Jews had to do and certain things that Jews couldn't do, right? We spoke all about this several weeks ago. All of a sudden, a paradox happens for the Jewish people, which was at the stroke of a pen in different countries, France, Germany, England, all of a sudden overnight, all legal barriers to anti-Semitism were lifted. And so one might think, okay, great, everything will be happily ever after. Jews will live peacefully as nice Frenchmen or Germans or Polish people. But of course, we know historically, anti-Semitism was not immediately alleviated. And in some cases, anti-Semitism, even if it temporarily got better, actually in a lot of cases started getting much worse. And so this opened up what scholars call the Jewish question. And it was a question that both the Jews were dealing with internally and externally of, what do we do? And so we discussed a number of answers to this last week in terms of, do Jews go all in on liberalism? Do Jews go all in on communism and Marxism? Do Jews go all in on trying to prove they are just the best French people ever? And maybe they're Jew by religion only, but they're more aligned with France or America as, let's say, the early Reform movement tried. Today, we're going to discuss a different answer to the Jewish problem, or a different proposed solution, which is, of course, Zionism. And so just to share my screen a little bit, and we will pop in to some sources. Give me 1 second. Perfect. Okay, so this out of all the classes, right, starting to talk about Zionism, and this will serve as sort of an introduction, I feel is almost as hard as anything else in Jewish history, because there's two different natural starting points that one could imagine for opening up a conversation about Zionism. And I want to try to make the argument that they're both correct, even though they are different. And so one natural starting point, and where I want to start here a little bit, is the idea of the diaspora, or in Hebrew, Galut. And for those that have been, with us for the past 14 weeks of Jewish history, this, of course, will not be a new idea, right? We're all familiar with the fact that in the 1st century CE, right? The vast majority of the Jewish world was exiled from the land of Israel, and they were spread out throughout the known world at the time, right? This is something that we discussed in length during sort of the middle classes here. And this ushered into roughly 2,000 years of Jewish history that it could be said that the entire Jewish world was in galut, right? The Hebrew word for diaspora. And it's not just an academic statement to say, oh, yes, Jews were not in Israel, they were in diaspora. Jews would have felt it. And what do I mean by feel it? It would have been a part of their daily lives, right? And a couple of those rituals and a couple of these prayers have, of course, carried over to modern times. So just a couple of famous examples that I'm sure everybody here is intimately familiar with, right? Every Passover, we say, next year in Jerusalem, right? And that is a wish that Jews have been saying for thousands of years, right? On perhaps the most communal and family-centric Jewish night of the year, we are basically recognizing that we are not in the ideal state, right? No pun intended, right? But the ideal state would be a return to our ancient homeland, Israel, right? Another famous example is if we look at the origins as to why we break the glass at Jewish weddings, right? The last thing that happens under the chuppah is the breaking of the glass, and then you recite a poem from Psalms that says, Jerusalem, if I forget you, let my right hand forget what it's supposed to do. And this is a beautiful song, right? Im eshkachech Yerushalayim. And the rabbis instituted this, again, about 1700 years ago, because they explicitly say, at the time when one might think you're supposed to be the most happy, right? Hopefully under your wedding canopy, you're specifically supposed to insert in some sadness because you have to remember that Jerusalem was destroyed. And this is, of course, right, we can probably spend the next hour and a half with going over a myriad of examples as to how this feeling of diaspora has been quite ubiquitous throughout Judaism over the past 18, 19, 2,000 years, right? The other, of course, famous example is the holiday of Tisha B'Av every year, where again, we still mourn the destruction of Jerusalem. There's actually a famous, probably mythical, but I'll say it anyway, because last week we spoke a little bit about Napoleon and Napoleon convening the Grand Sanhedrin. But there's a famous story, again, I can't attest to the historical truth of the story, but one Tisha B'Av night, Napoleon is walking through the streets of Paris and he hears out of a synagogue just crying and wailing and all of this. And so he goes and he asks somebody that's coming out and he says, you know, what's the matter? What happened? And the Jew says, well, our temple was destroyed, right? We're mourning. And Napoleon, of course, right, said, oh my goodness, right? When did this happen? You know, how can I help, right? He thought this was something that happened last Tuesday, right? Do you need funds to build a new one? And the Jew sort of smirks and says, no, this was, you know, in 70 CE, right? This is 1700 years ago at that point. And Napoleon was purported to say, a nation that after 1800 years is still mourning the fact that they have been exiled will surely merit to return to their homeland. Now, again, whether or not that is a historical story or there is truth in that story, even if it's false, right? I think it encapsulates this idea, right? And for people that, again, have stayed with us for the past 14 weeks of Jewish history, has seen a turn of what happens during exile and that connection to the land. I see Michael has a question. Go for it, Michael. And then we'll trek on a little bit.
Yes, I just want to add something to that story about Napoleon. He said, actually, at the end, he said, why don't you go and get it? It's yours. It's yours. And they answered him, no, we are not going to go and fight and get it. You'll have to give us back the country. Are you familiar with that part?
I am, yeah. And we'll get into that a little bit later because it gets immediately trickier when we make the switch. And I'm going to go here in about 10 minutes. So I you know, whenever I get distracted on tangents, I never finish. But it gets really immediately tricky when we try to draw a 100% causal link between feeling of diaspora and modern Zionism. I'm going to get there in about 8 or 9 minutes, and we'll see why. But I think this is a foundational place to start. And I will never talk about Zionism on any level without mentioning this idea of the diaspora and the fact that we used to be in Israel, because for any understanding of Zionism, this is premise one, meaning even if somebody is not religious, if somebody has no understanding of Zionism, if somebody just wants to understand, a political situation in modern Israel, this understanding that for most of Jewish history, we felt tangibly as if we were in the diaspora is a crucial understanding, because this was and is still the continued motivating factor of Zionism, of which I, of course, identify as. So it's not the whole picture, and we'll get to the whole picture in a second. And hopefully everybody will leave here probably a little bit more confused. And I think Zionism in Israel is probably going to take 2 weeks, so we will be able to continue next week here. But this is, again, step one, right? Feeling for most of Jewish history as if we were in the diaspora. And as Michael Semi alluded to before, there was very little being done about it, right? This is also the second important thing to understand, meaning for most of Jewish history, there was never an attempt to organize a return to the homeland. Now, there are, of course, a couple of outliers. So one interesting person to mention, and we actually spent half a class talking about Judah Halevi, who was a well-known Spanish thinker and poet. So he wrote probably one of the most famous poems about Israel and Zionism that we have in our tradition, which was, "My heart is in the East, but I am at the edge of the West." And when he said edge of the West, he, of course, was talking about Spain, not California. But we can say that we are even more at the edge of West than Judah Halevi. But of course, he's talking about this longing for return to a land. And actually, at the end of his life, he leaves everything, right? He leaves his community in Spain. And of course, he was probably a very popular person in the community. And he risks basically everything to get on a ship heading to Israel. But he was very much an outlier, right? And this was not a thing that a lot of Jews were practically doing throughout history. So this is also important to understand. So we get back to where we really started this conversation. And this is, again, will mostly be a review of last week, but I think it's so crucial to understand these two historical forces mixing to end up in modern Zionism. So we talked about the diaspora, and now I'm going to reintroduce the Jewish question. And again, for some of us, this might be review, but starting in the late 1700s, when Napoleon issued that famous edict saying Jews are free, right? They are now equal citizens. Of course, anti-Semitism still persisted. So it led to this Jewish internal question of who are we, right? Are we a minority religious group? Are we a nationhood? Are we a race, as some people are calling us? Are we an ethnicity, right? So all of these questions were being, of course, debated all throughout the Jewish community, and different Jewish thinkers were suggesting different things. This, of course, also was a question that the wider society was asking on the Jews. So both Jewish community leaders were trying to figure out who are the Jews and what are our place in society. And of course, external leaders, ones that were both very good to the Jews and of course, others that were terrible to the Jews, were also asking the Jewish question, right? Of course, the most nefarious answer to the Jewish question was Hitler's. And the reason why, I don't want to get too much into this because the Holocaust happens after where most of the Zionist movement started. I think one fallacy that people have that I'm always trying to break is that Zionism was a result of the Holocaust, which is, I think, a sad fallacy that many have adopted. But the reason why Hitler's program to exterminate the Jews was called the final solution is because the question was a Jewish question. And so that's just one tangent on names here, right? So we went over last week a couple of the different solutions and attempted solutions by the Jewish community to say, here's who we are, right? And in some cases, they said we are a religious community. In some cases, we are a peoplehood. In some cases, all of these things. And what was happening throughout the 1800s is that one by one, all of these proposed solutions were not working. Now, what do I mean by not working? Well, some Jews joined the communist revolution and became ardent socialists and communists. And what do you know, right? Communism did not stop anti-Semitism. Other Jews became staunch nationalists for whatever country they were in. So if they were French, they became French nationalists. And if they were German, they became German nationalists. And what do you know? That didn't work, right? Others became what we might consider democratic liberals and tried to say, well, if society just progresses in its natural way, eventually everybody will be equal and anti-Semitism will be cured there, right? They tried that and that didn't work. So eventually we are introduced to a young man named Theodor Herzl. Again, I don't think this name will be new to anybody here, but hopefully this framing will be, if not new, interesting. And Herzl was an Austrian, and he was writing in the late 1800s. Now, what's interesting about Herzl, and this will open up into a conversation about Zionism and how to think about Zionism as a Jewish movement is that Herzl was a socialist, atheist assimilationist. Now, this is not, a slew of online ad hominem attacks against Herzl. He genuinely was all of these things and writes about it. And so what do I mean by all of these things? So we'll go through this, right? Many enlightened secular Jews at the time in Europe were socialists, meaning both from an economic point of view and also as their preferred solution to how to help Jews in the modern world, adopted socialism as their cause, right? Like a lot of enlightened Jews at the time, Herzl had no use for God and no use for Jewish religion. And most importantly, and this is where things get interesting, Herzl was an assimilationist. And Herzl actually writes at the beginning of his life, right, or probably sometime in his 20s, that what Jews need to do in order to be safe, right, the solution to the Jewish question is assimilation. What do you mean by assimilation? Well, if Jews completely eradicate Jewish identity, then anti-Semitism will eventually solve itself, right? And so Herzl had very little patience for Judaism and Jewish tradition and Jewish ideas, right? Herzl wanted Jews to be able to assimilate. Now, what happens is as he grows up, again, common historical lore, academics debate whether how true this is, say it was the Dreyfus affairs that finally woke up Herzl from his thinking, right? It was probably a much more naturalistic cause of seeing, right, in one of the most socially progressive places in Western Europe, France, where he moves and he acts as a journalist, he sees that he can assimilate all he wants. People on the streets are still seeing him as Jewish. And so Herzl, of course, has his own sort of crisis of, I'll call it progressivism. And he realizes that no matter what he's going to do as a young assimilated Jew, nothing is working, right? Jews cannot convert out of anti-Semitism. Jews cannot assimilate out of anti-Semitism. And so what Herzl proposes is, by now we know as the manifesto of political Zionism, but he writes a famous essay called A Solution of the Jewish Question, right? And then which eventually turns into his book, The Jewish State. And what Herzl proposes is as follows. I'm going to read just some excerpts here. I know there's a famous trick whenever you're doing a slideshow to never put this much text on a singular slide. So I apologize for breaking that rule. But I do feel like this is an important essay, or at least some excerpts to understand Herzl's ideas. And this is going to sound familiar to everything we've just discussed before. So what Herzl says is the Jewish question still exists. Now, again, he is writing at the end of the 1800s. This is about 100 years after the Haskalah was in full force and about 100 years after emancipation in most Western European countries. And so now 3 or 4 generations later, if we imagine 100 years, the Jewish question still exists, meaning, what do you know in the year 1896 in France, anti-Semitism is not solved yet. It is a remnant of the Middle Ages, he writes, which civilized nations do not even yet seem able to shake off, try as they will. They certainly showed a generous desire to do so when they emancipated us, right? So he's saying, well, yeah, there were some forward thinkers that really did try to help out the Jewish community and, really try to emancipate us, but this didn't work. The Jewish question exists wherever Jews live in perceptible numbers. Where it does not exist, it is carried by Jews in the course of their migrations. We naturally move to those places where we are not persecuted, and there our presence produces persecution. This is the case in every country and will remain so even in those highly civilized, for instance, France, until the Jewish question finds a solution on a political basis. The unfortunate Jews are now carrying the seeds of anti-Semitism into England. They have already introduced it into America. And so Herzl starts off, again, this is from the introduction of his book, The Jewish State, and he's framing the problem, right, which is a problem still familiar to us. There is still anti-Semitism, even though one can read through the legal books. And what do you know when you look at the laws of France, the laws of America, the laws of England, the laws of Germany, it says Jews shall be equal. What do you know when you actually go on the streets? Jews are not finding equality. And in a lot of cases, Jews are being specifically hurt by anti-Semitic ideas. Now Herzl makes his famous pivot. So see what he does here. He says, I consider the Jewish question neither a social nor a religious one, right? This is a really important line, because this is now the first time really that we start to see a political solution to the Jewish question, right? Plenty of Jewish thinkers have thought of the Jewish question as, let's take these in order, right? For the Jewish question to be a social question, that is something that can be solved by sociology. What do I mean by sociology? So perhaps the solution to the Jewish question needs to be either social movements of liberalism that accept them more, or Jews assimilating into the wider world, right? Perhaps it's a sociological question. He rejects that. Now, perhaps it's a religious question, right? We saw this attempted solution last week, right? The reform movement, again, both in Germany in the early 1800s and then reiterated in the Pittsburgh platform in the late 1800s, almost at the exact same time, by the way, that Herzl wrote this, proposed a religious solution to the Jewish question. Meaning what the early reform movement taught was that Jews are just a religion, and just a religion means they should be accepted as good Germans or good Frenchmen or good Americans. And it just so happens that when they go into synagogue, right, it's not so different than what the Christians are doing. And so we're just like you, just maybe our God is spelled a different way, right? But for the rest of the week, and when we're not in synagogue, right, we are the exact same. Therefore, we should be accepted as normal Germans or normal Frenchmen and normal Americans and get all the social treatment that there's that they get, right? So Herzl rejects this also, right? He says, even though it sometimes takes these and these other forms, what is the Jewish question? It is a national question. So he is saying what a lot of people, mostly actually anti-Semites, are thinking is that the Jewish question is not a question of sociology or religion. This is a question of nationhood, right? There is something about nationalism that on the one hand is deeply bad for the Jews, that if you're a staunch German nationalist or a staunch French nationalist, you might not be so open to Jews. And maybe to solve it then, Jews need a nationalistic solution. So he says it is a national question, and to solve it, we must first of all establish it as an international political problem to be discussed and settled by the civilized nations of the world in council. Then he says, we are a people, one people. We have sincerely tried to merge with the national communities in which we live, seeking only to preserve the faith of our fathers. So he says, we've tried, right? Don't say we haven't tried, right? It's been 100 years since emancipation. We've done everything we could to become Frenchmen and Germans and Americans and all of these different religious traditions, but it's not permitted to us. In vain, we are loyal patriots, sometimes super loyal. In vain do we make the same sacrifices of life and property as our fellow citizens. In vain do we strive to enhance the fame of our native lands in the arts and the sciences, or her wealth by trade and commerce. In our native land where we have lived for centuries, we are still decried as aliens, often by men whose ancestors had not yet come at a time when Jewish sighs had long been heard in the country, right? A very powerful line. We've been here for longer than you, he's basically saying. And a lot of this is, by the way, this is not him going on a crusader polemic against, one could imagine, Jews of opposite political persuasions. To some extent, he's also arguing against himself, meaning he used to be of the opinion that if we're just a little bit more German or a little bit more French, then maybe in 3 months or maybe in 2 years or maybe in 30 years, the German people will finally accept us as fully German and not this sort of other that Jews have been throughout history. And so he says oppression and persecution cannot exterminate us. No nation on earth has endured such struggles and sufferings as we have. Jew baiting has merely winnowed out our weaklings, the strong among us defiantly return to their own wherever persecution opens up. So Herzl, again, creates a platform, just to go back to the source for a second. Herzl publishes his paper, and of course, Herzl is not the first person in the 1800s to talk about an attempted political solution to the Jewish problem. There are some others like Leo Pinsker, Moshe Hess, right? There are some names that people might have heard, but Herzl is the first person to write this pamphlet and then to actually start doing something about it, right? It's one thing to have an idea of, well, wouldn't it be nice if we did this? The second Herzl publishes this, he already starts convening councils and starts lobbying political groups. And at this time, and we'll talk about the history a little bit in probably 20-ish minutes, he starts lobbying the Ottoman Empire to try to buy land for the early Zionist project. He starts lobbying other American communities and trying to raise money for Zionism. And so Herzl writes this, and of course, this becomes all the talk in the Jewish world, right? And this becomes one of the most controversial ideas right? And in this course, we've talked about a lot of controversial ideas, right? I don't have to reiterate all of these. This becomes one of the biggest Jewish discussions. And so if we took a time machine back to the year 1900, right at the outset of, and I'll call this political Zionism. I'm calling it political Zionism because it is Zionism in the sense of a return to homeland. And it's political because the goal of this is really politics. And what I mean by that, and what Herzl meant by that, is the only goal of Zionism, and this is going to be important for a second, the only goal of Zionism is for Jews to be in control of their political destiny, right? Jews need to be in charge of their own police force. Jews need to be in charge of their own army. Jews need to be in charge of the own court system, because we can't trust, for lack of I'll use a crude term, right? We can't trust the goyim, right? We can't trust the wider world, because every time we do, it ends badly to us. So Herzl was a political Zionist. So we open up this question that we started with, which is, when talking about Zionism, there's a tension here, and there's almost a catch-22 of where do we start? And this is, of course, a big question, right? If one is a very passionate Zionist, they'll have one strong feeling to this. If one is a passionate anti-Zionist, they might have another feeling to this. I'm going to try to approach this from as objective as possible of a place. And so the question is, we could argue, and I could be 100% content with my personal honesty, and I can stand here and I can argue Zionism is a natural or inevitable part of Jewish tradition. And that is 100% true, right? This is a true statement, in my opinion. Why? Because of all the things we've said before. Every year we've said next year in Jerusalem. We had this idea of ingathering of the exiles that for thousands of years, traditional Jews have said in the Shemona Esrei, the Amidah, 3 times a day, where we say, God, please gather the exiles, right, back to the land of Israel. And so we have this one idea of Zionism, which is, again, a true and correct view of Zionism. The Zionism is a return to almost both our historic homeland, right, our indigenous historic homeland, and 2, a return to almost the ideal state of how Jews and the Jewish people were supposed to be until exile came and messed that up, right? This is one view of Zionism. Another view of Zionism is the complete opposite. And here's where the catch-22 comes. I can also stand here and I can argue to you that Zionism is a departure from Jewish tradition. Now, 2 things to say about that before I explain how. One, something being a departure from Jewish tradition does not mean it's necessarily bad for Judaism, right? Again, this is, I think, the 15th class in our journey through Jewish history. There are plenty of other things that we've discussed here together that were also departures from Jewish tradition. The Talmud was a departure from Jewish tradition. Medieval philosophy was a departure from Jewish tradition. Kabbalah and Jewish mysticism was a departure from Jewish tradition. The Haskalah was a departure, right? So saying something is a departure does not mean that thing is somehow negative or bad. But there is a view of Zionism that suggests, there is a view of Judaism that suggests that Zionism is a movement that was almost outside, at least originally, the bounds of Judaism, right? And we can also find sources for this in our liturgy and in our traditional literature. And we'll go over this a little bit more, right? For instance, for the last 2,000 years, we've also, every time there's a holiday, we add in an additional prayer called Musaf, which in Hebrew just means additional. And one of the famous lines in the Musaf of holidays is, Bipnei chateinu kalenu me'artzenu, right? Because of our sins, we have been exiled from our land. And this actually turns out to be a very mainstream view throughout our Jewish tradition, right? Even Maimonides quotes that Israel is to be redeemed by teshuvah alone. And so we get another idea of a return to Israel. And this will be important in a second for understanding dynamics, both in terms of early Zionism and even in modern day Israel, that from some actually traditional religious view, a political return to the land of Israel might actually be an abrogation from tradition. Because the argument goes, right, without whether or not we agree with this argument, the traditional Jewish view has been, if we were kicked out of Israel, it must have been because God wanted it, because of something we did. Therefore, the way back to Israel is through redemption, usually coupled in a messianic era. And I always say, and this is one interesting way to think about it. I'm very fond of thought experiments with time machines, because this is, I think, the second or third time I've referenced this. If we take a time machine back to the 1600s, and it doesn't matter where you go in the 1600s, right? Half of us can go to Poland, the other half Morocco, Yemen, Iran, right? Any country you imagine that Jews lived in the 1600s. And you said, I'm from the future, I'm from the year 2023. And just so you know, we're about to celebrate Israel's 75th birthday, right? Yom Ha'atzmaut's coming up in a couple of weeks, right? Israel is turning 75 this year. They would say, oh my goodness, the Messiah has come. And if you tell them, no, sorry, sorry if I wasn't clear, the Messiah hasn't come yet, we've just returned to Israel, they would think that's impossible. Meaning, in the traditional Jewish mind, the return to Israel was coupled, foundationally coupled to the idea of Mashiach or a messianic era. And so for one to happen without the other was almost a breaking, to some extent. I'm going to use the word breaking, and you'll see why in a minute, of classic Jewish theology. Even more so, this is true when the person who did it, or the people who did it, were secular, not traditional, atheistic, and socialist, right? This was seen by some extent as an impossibility from the standpoint of tradition. There's also a view, by the way, from Herzl that suggests that maybe Herzl himself, right? Herzl was an assimilationist. So we know that Herzl had no love for Jewish tradition. Herzl, actually, just one story about Herzl that might be familiar, and then we can open it up for some conversation, because I'm sure this slide is provocative enough to give some good fodder. Herzl was offered early on by the British government Uganda to be a Jewish state, right? This is a story that probably some of us are familiar with. And Herzl, of course, says yes. Oh, I would love having Uganda as a Jewish state, right? If the British government, again, this was at the height of European colonialism, if the British government is willing to hand the Zionist movement Uganda, right? That's way easier. I don't have to deal with that pesky Ottoman Empire, right? This is pre-World War I, right? Let's take it. And of course, when he presents this to the rest of the Zionist Congress, most of the people say no, right? They say, what are you talking about? We haven't wanted for 2,000 years to go to Uganda. But from Herzl's point of view, all Herzl cared about was Jews being in control of their own political destiny. And you could do that anywhere, right? Why do you need to do that on the soil that Abraham or Moses or King David walked, right? And so from Herzl's point of view, right, this was all about politics. And so there's one way to view Zionism, right, that this was a break from Jewish tradition. On the other hand, it's impossible to view it as a total break, because the Zionist movement basically said, no, we need it to be in Israel, right? And not only should it be in Israel, we should actually redeem the national language. And not only should we redeem the national language, we should redeem the ancient Jewish currency from biblical times, the shekel. And not only should it be that, but the engram of our country should be the menorah, which was the symbol of Jewish nationalism in the 2nd century BCE, right? So you can see the tension in this debate. One other point, and then before we continue, so David Hartman, again, a well-known rabbi in the late 20th century, gave a great analogy to understanding at least Herzl and his brand of political Zionism. And he says it's like a teenager who is getting mad at her parents for some reason, and yells into the kitchen, I hate you, mom and dad, I'm leaving and never coming home, and slams the door, but yet she's still in her room, right? And so to some extent, this analogy is, right, early political Zionists saying, we are breaking from Jewish tradition, we want nothing to do with it, and then of course returning to the most Jewish place possible and reviving all these Jewish symbols, right? And so to get into some of the tension of what was happening now, when Herzl proposes a solution, this creates a Jewish-wide debate and discussion where there were many, of course, on his side, and many, and actually in the beginning, many more that were against Herzl's solution. And the other group that was against Zionism at the outset, and this includes, again, virtually all Reform Jews in, let's say, if we were in the year 1900 and we did a Pew poll of Reform Jews, both in Europe and America, they would say Judaism is a universalist. I think I spelled that word wrong, so I apologize. Judaism is a universalist tradition. And the way to pure anti-Semitism is not for us to push particularism, right? It's not more nationalism, it's more universalism and more liberalism. And so we can start to see the parameters of Zionism. And if somebody asks, is Zionism a part of traditional Judaism or not a part of traditional Judaism, there are good arguments for both sides. Taking a step back, any thoughts, questions, anything like that? We'll take a minute or two here. Michael, go for it.
I just wanted to add something that I wrote in the chat. Actually, the first thing that Herzl tried to do is to convert en masse all the Jews to Catholicism. And the Pope rejected that idea on the account that the Jewish race is corrupt. Actually, that word was used in the Catholic Bible until recently. It so happened that I had this version of the Bible and I came across it. I couldn't believe it. They used in Moses' speech where he says, you are a corrupt generation. They changed the word generation to a race.
That is interesting. Yeah, thank you for that, Michael. Other thoughts, questions, comments here?
It's Rosalie.
Yeah, go for it.
There's something I've never understood, and I know I've missed the beginning classes. I've probably taken the last 8, but I never ever can understand if the Israelis were sent out of their homeland thousands of years ago to Babylonia. Isn't it true that the spoils of the war go to the winners? So why 2,000 years later are we still saying it's our homeland and we need to go back? They're doing that all over Europe, but if you lose the war, why are you still wanting to reclaim it?
Yeah, it's a good question. So just to take this question, and then we'll probably get into this a lot more next week when we actually talk about.
I can wait.
Can I answer that?
Just one or two comments. Just on this is there's sort of two different questions being asked here. So just to tease them apart, when Jews have talked about where Judaism traditionally has talked about a return to Israel, this was almost certainly for thousands of years, not from a political view, meaning, right, and this is true for the entirety of the Hebrew Bible and the rabbinic tradition and the medieval tradition, the idea of why Jews either merit to be in Israel or have, merited to be kicked out of Israel was seen as a personal religious question, right? Whether or not we agree with the theology behind it, that's a separate question, but just to understand what it means in the Jewish traditional mind for exile to have happened was a personal failing. And so it had nothing to do with, whatever nation happened to take over. It wasn't seen as, right. The best example for this, by the way, is the rabbis ask a question. I think I probably mentioned this 10 or so weeks ago. The rabbis ask, why was Jerusalem destroyed by the Romans in the 1st century? And now if you ask a historian why Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans in the 1st century, the obvious answer would be the Roman Empire was much stronger. They had better weaponry. They were a lot bigger and they wanted to conquer the land. And so they were able to, right? The rabbis say, well, the reason why the Jews merited to have the temple in Jerusalem destroyed is because there was too much hatred in the community, right? Jews were hating each other, sinach chinam, right? For no reason, people were treating each other badly. Now, is that a political answer? Is that a theological answer, right? It gets a little bit more complicated. The second question, which hopefully we'll get to next week, is about sort of quote unquote, who has the right to a land and what does it mean to have a right to a land, right? That's a more modern question of, a question as broad as, do Jews or Israelis or Zionists, do they have a right to the land? What about other groups? What about Palestinians? What about, so that is a question hopefully we'll deal with next week. So I want to pocket that for now. I see a couple other hands. We'll take 5 more minutes for questions. Everybody's go for it.
Rabbi?
Yeah,
I have my hand raised. I have a couple of things. First of all, in the Babylonian exile, Cyrus sent us back. he let people go back. There were people who decided to stay. So that's, you can talk about that one, but it's really the second temple that sent us out into the real diaspora. So I just finished a book by Dara Horn, called Eternal Life, about a woman and a man who lived, for centuries. And in it, we had a good laugh at the Rabbi's book group because, everybody's thinking, apropos of why did the temple fall? And in it, the main male character says it's because the Romans had better weapons. That's number one. And number two was, just another light kind of thing, but maybe not so light. I don't know if anybody's read Michael Chabon's Yiddish Policemen's Union. And in that case, they're up in Alaska. They rejected Uganda and they ended up in Alaska. So, there have been authors who've been playing with this for quite a while.
Yeah, 100%. And those are both good books. Dara Horn's Eternal Light and Michael Chabon's Yiddish Policemen's Union. Highly recommend both those books, and they both take very different perspectives. So I'll just leave that. So I'm going to continue a little bit.
Rabbi Daniel, I have one comment.
Yeah.
I want to answer Rosalie's comment that the spoils of wars goes to the victor, not the land, not the land. As a matter of fact, to this day, it is in the United Nations Charter. You cannot take a land by force. It is not against our understanding. And not only that, the Jews claimed the land to go back there because they had 1,000 years of state for 1,000 years. And even though they did have this right, as they claimed, they did not go to Israel by force. They did not.
Michael, let's pause there just because we're going to get there. So I don't want to get
one word. Jewish National Fund collected money and bought the land.
So Michael, we're going to get there in like 20 minutes. So just hold that for a second.
But it's an answer to Rosalie's question.
Okay, so just to reframe and focus here, right? So again, we have the Zionism both as a natural, inevitable step. We have Zionism as departure, right? I think there's a lot of truth in both of these ideas, and hopefully this gives us a better understanding of what was happening in the late 1800s, early 1900s, just ideologically in the Jewish community, right? And nothing I'm saying here, and I hope this comes across, is normative, right? I'm trying to be descriptive. Happy to talk about my own normative opinions later or another time. So this, of course, creates strong anti-Zionist backlash, right? And we discussed this a little bit more, but just so we have a better understanding of the Jewish world. Again, this is true both in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and also the Jewish world today in 2023, is that there were two primary camps that became anti-Zionist. One I will call the liberal Jewish critique of Zionism, and the other the Orthodox Jewish critique against Zionism. So perhaps the figurehead of the liberal Jewish critique against Zionism, and now one important caveat that I want to mention is that all of these critiques were before the state was founded. And I think that is important to keep in mind, right? The analogy that I always give, and I think this is a good analogy, is it's one thing for two people to debate whether or not they want to have a child. It's another for them to debate once they already have the child, if they should kill the child, right? Just as a crude analogy. And so to some extent, being an anti-Zionist in the year 1900 is a perfectly fine position, right? Meaning maybe I would agree with it if I lived there, maybe I wouldn't agree with it. I can certainly understand it, right? Obviously, history, hindsight is 2020, knowing what happened in Europe in the mid-20th century. But I have no idea, if I'm being honest, what I would have thought if I was dropped in a time machine 120 years ago and lived there. I think personally, this is a personal belief of mine, that it is different once the state exists to be an anti-Zionist and want the state to be abolished. So I just want to say that at the outset. But understanding these early 20th century critiques against Zionism, I think is important to understand just how controversial of an idea Zionism was in the Jewish world when it was first put forward. So our first thinker, Hermann Cohen, was a well-known Jewish German philosopher. And I'm going to guess, there are 27 people in this Zoom call right now. I'm going to guess probably the majority of people here have not heard of him. I might be wrong and be miscorrected. And one of the reasons why you might not have heard of him, even though for his time he was one of the most important Jewish thinkers really of the post-Enlightenment era is because he was so historically wrong about this issue. And I'll explain what I mean in a minute. But first, let's understand his criticism, and then we'll understand how he was incorrect. So he becomes very against Zionism, again, from a Jewish point of view. And he writes in one of his essays, this political religious orientation of ours constitutes, for all practical purposes, the difference between us and Zionism. While the Zionist believes that Judaism can be preserved only by an all-encompassing Jewish nationalism, we are of the opposite view, believing that only a universal, mankind-oriented Judaism can preserve the Jewish religion. So exactly what I said before, right? He thinks the way to solve the Jewish question is universalism, not particularism, right? Is if Jews become more liberal, more progressive, right? They push society towards, right? No borders, no people, no difference, then eventually that will solve anti-Semitism, right? One of the reasons why I think he's sort of been, at least in the mainstream, lost in the Jewish canon is sadly, he's writing this, I believe, in either the 19-teens or the 1920s. And he goes on to then talk about, he was German, to talk about how Germany represents the best potential future for Jews, and that Germany is the most progressive country in the world, and Jews just need to lean into German nationalism just a little bit more, and then the Jewish question will be solved. And so he was, of course, wrong, but at least intellectually where he's coming from, one, I think is just an important ideological critique of Zionism to understand whatever we think of it. And two, this is still the point of view of, if I call it the Jewish anti-Zionist left, that of course exists today, right, primarily in America, where they say, this is not Judaism, right? Judaism is about universality, and Zionism is about particularity. And even more so, one might imagine somebody argues, the acts of what Zionism has done is contrary to Judaism as a tradition, right? So Hermann Cohen gives a voice, or sort of is the first thinker of what we might call the Jewish universalism, or some people call it diasporic nationalism, meaning that the best case for Judaism is to be, let's say, a progressive in America and ensure that, the entire world becomes a place of equality and progressivism, right? Not to put, as he says in another place, not to put all of our cards in one basket and say, let's just lock ourselves up in this corner of the world, right? So that was Hermann Cohen. The other, and just for time, I won't go too far into this. The other is the Orthodox critique, which we talked about a little bit before, but this idea that we have to wait until the Messianic age, and this was virtually the view of the entirety of the Orthodox community in the year 1900, meaning there was, and we'll discuss religious Zionism in a few minutes, but if you go back to when Herzl published The Jewish State, there was virtually zero Orthodox Jews in the world that would have read that and thought this was a good idea. And it even got to the point where Yoel Teitelbaum is famous or notorious, however word you want to use. He is the head, or was the Satmar Rebbe. Satmar today is the biggest Hasidic sect in the world, where he came from a long line of staunch anti-Zionists, and it got to the point where he even blamed the Shoah, the Holocaust, on Zionism, right? And so this is, again, at the extreme of ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionism, but this Satmar is the largest Hasidic community in the world. I think, they have at least 100,000 members, although it's hard to count exactly how much, but the vast majority of the Orthodox community heard what Herzl was doing and basically said, no, thank you. This is a secular, anti-Jewish, anti-religious perspective. Okay, so we have our Herzl proposed solution to what was happening, and we have the criticism raining in on Herzl from all sides, right? The religious people hate it. The more secular, liberal, enlightened people hate it. We obviously don't have Pew polling from the year 1897 after Herzl publishes it, but I can tell you that the vast, vast majority of the Jewish world were not Zionists in the late 1800s, right? For one reason or other, they thought either that this was a bad idea or a far-fetched idea, right? Probably a lot more thought the second, that, well, this is never going to work. What's Herzl talking about, right? This can never happen. But I'm sure there were a lot in the former of just saying, for either religious reason or social reason or ideological reason, this is a bad idea. Enter in another important thinker named Asher Ginsburg, who is writing in the pen name Achad Ha'am, And Achad Ha'am takes a different critique of Herzl, right? Achad Ha'am shows up at the first Zionist Congress, right? He is interested in Herzl's idea, right? He's not rejecting it. And he's listening to Herzl and he's thinking, again, I'm paraphrasing here, and he says, Herzl's onto something here, but I don't think he fully understands what the Jewish question is. And so he, in response, 1 year later, after Herzl publishes his manifesto of political Zionism, he writes his own book called The Jewish State and Jewish Problem, right? So again, a very similar title to Herzl. And then again, I'm going to break the rule by having a large quote, but I promise this is interesting and important. So Achad Ha'am writes as follows: "It is not Jews who have come out of the ghetto. Judaism has come out too." So already he's doing something that Herzl never did, right? He is saying there are two things here. We're not just dealing with one entity. Herzl was just interested in Jews, right? Herzl was interested in ensuring that Jews were safe. If Jews can ensure their safety by converting to Christianity, they should do it. If Jews can ensure their safety by assimilating, they should do it. If Jews can ensure their safety by creating a political nation state in Russia or Uganda or Alaska, they should do it. What Achad Ha'am is saying is Herzl's missing half the equation here, right? It's not just Jews that we should care about. It's Judaism too, right? Judaism has come out too. And so he writes, "For Jews, the exodus is confined to certain countries and is due to toleration, but Judaism has come out of its own accord whenever it has come into contact with modern culture. The contact with modern culture overturns the defenses of Judaism from within, so that Judaism can no longer remain isolated and live a life apart. The spirit of our people strives for development. It wants to absorb those elements of a general culture which reach it from the outside, to digest them and to make them a part of itself, as it has done before at different periods of its history. But the conditions of life in exile are not suitable. In our time, culture wears in each country the garb of national spirit, and the stranger who would woo her must sink his individuality and become absorbed in the dominant spirit. For this reason, Judaism in exile cannot develop its individuality in its own way. When it leaves the ghetto walls, it is in danger of losing its essential being, or at best, its national unity. It is in danger of being split up into many kinds of Judaism, each with a different character of life, as there are countries of Jewish dispersion. What we need," he concludes, "is to establish a state which will be a Jewish state, not just a state of Jews." What Achad Ha'am essentially does is says, Herzl had basically the right solution, although he differentiated a little bit, but his problem was formulated wrong. Herzl's just interested in Jews. We need to also think about Judaism. And the Enlightenment has also had an effect on Judaism. That Judaism is being split up and being watered down and assimilating and going into all these denominations, right? Again, this is now 80 years after the Reform movement and Orthodox movement and conservative movement. Jews have already started migrating to America, right? 1881 was a major Jewish migration to America. And Achad Ha'am is looking at all this and he says, there are two problems here. One is that there's anti-Semitism and we're not safe. And two is that Judaism practiced in the diaspora is getting so watered down, right, in his words, and it's assimilating so much that it is becoming, right, he says this in a different place, a weak, diluted confessional religion, as opposed to the unique, multifaceted civilization that it's supposed to be. And so Achad Ha'am is sort of reading the writing on the wall, and he joins the Zionist movement, but he says that what Judaism needs is not just a political solution. Judaism also needs a cultural solution. And so we're introduced now to the second type of Zionism, which is cultural Zionism, right? Which is something that people here might have heard in different configurations. And Achad Ha'am ends up being almost prophetic in his idea of what Zionism in Israel should be. And just a couple interesting ways to think about this, right? And now we can start to see that, right, the early Zionist movement, I mean, not that anybody here thought that any Jewish movement, everybody internally would agree on everything, but even within the early Zionist movement, you already have this foundational debate that is going on, a debate that in some sense might still be replicated in Israel today, which is Israel just supposed to be a political country that protects Jews? Or is Israel supposed to be a Jewish state? Is Israel supposed to have Jewish values? Is Israel a country that is important for all Jews in the world or just for its citizens, right? All of these questions in which probably we're all familiar with, Achad Ha'am opens up this wider question. And what he writes about, and one of the reasons why I call it prophetic, is he talks about in this essay, again, this is another one of those essays that I highly recommend, but he writes this essay by basically saying, once we establish a Zionist center, then this place is going to serve as inspiration to all the different Jewish communities in the world. And he's almost describing something that probably a lot of us take for granted, that today, let's say, many young Jews travel to Israel, right? There's all these programs, a lot of people are inspired by it, right? And again, without getting into politics, we'll get there next week, right? Israel is a place for a lot of people, especially people who grow up in America, where for the first time they see that Judaism is not just a Jewish version of Protestantism, where there's about 3 hours a week that you show up to church or synagogue, you pray, and then you go home, and then your other 6.5 days of the week you're just a normal American, right? Israel is a place which is a full Jewish civilization, which of course comes with this tensions, but it means, right? And some of these examples might seem banal, but I think something emerges that is greater than the sum of its parts. The holidays are not going to be Christian holidays. They'll be Jewish holidays. The language will be the language of Hebrew, right? The currency will be our ancient Jewish currency. The streets will be named after great Jewish thinkers as opposed to great European or Christian thinkers, right? All of these examples, right, add up to a sense where when Achad Ha'am is saying that Zionism needs to be worried about Judaism and not just Jews, we take a lot of this for granted in modern Israel, right? Of course, one other offshoot of this debate, and then I'll pause for comments here, is Herzl and a lot of the early political Zionists were more than happy for the national language of Israel to be either German or Yiddish or French or one of these languages, right? It was a man named Eliezer ben Yehuda who basically challenged him with a similar premise of Achad Ha'am, saying, wait a minute, nationhood and nationality is intimately connected to culture. If you're trying to reclaim an ancient national view of Judaism, you also need to reclaim ancient cultural components of Judaism. And so you obviously need to revive Hebrew. Herzl writes back, and a lot of political Zionists, and there's a famous essay of Herzl where he says, can you imagine how ridiculous that sounds to reclaim an ancient language that hasn't been spoken in thousands of years? Herzl, I always remember this example. Can you imagine how ridiculous it is to suggest that one day somebody will be able to order a train ticket in Hebrew? And so to some extent, right, Herzl wasn't even necessarily wrong for his time, meaning the idea of reviving Hebrew was seen as so crazy, right? Hebrew was the language that when you show up to synagogue, right, if you still do that, because again, most people in this debate hadn't been religious for 2-3 generations, that's the language you read the Bible in, or maybe some old rabbi, right, knows some Hebrew because he studied rabbinic literature. Nobody in the Jewish world speaks Hebrew, right? Even Yiddish to some extent was under attack. We discussed this last week because a lot of the Maskils, right, the Jews who had been part of the Enlightenment didn't like Yiddish anymore because they considered it a dirty, exilic and, impoverished, uncivilized language. And so this debate, again, becomes a very big debate in the early Zionist camp. Taking a pause, any comments or questions? We have 1 or 2 more movements to get through, and then next week we'll probably get to actual tangible history and everything. Noah Stein, and great to see you, Noah. Noah was a Hillel student of ours, and then he is now working as an engineer in Indianapolis. The language debate within Zionism and its outcome are most fascinating. Yeah, the language debate, by the way, just because you said that, and I love the story, the debate about languages got so intense. There's actually something called Milchamot HaSefaot, right? The battle, the war of the languages. And in the early 1920s in British Mandate Palestine, as one could imagine, right, there were newspapers. And so this question had, of course, a lot of practical importance, right? What language were the national newspapers going to be written in? What language do you teach in kindergarten, right? These are, of course, very important questions that, of course, people get very riled up on. And so there was a number of actually attacks back and forth between Yiddish newspapers and Hebrew newspapers, where the Hebraicists would, cherry bomb the printers of the Yiddish newspaper so that on Sunday, nobody would be able to read the news in Yiddish. And so they had to defer to Hebrew. And so even if people's Hebrew was weak, well, if you want to know what's going on, you have to know Hebrew, because what do you know? All the Yiddish printers have been blown up, right? So this was a fascinating time in history where, again, there was a real battle for the soul to some extent of here. And Michael just added in the comments, which I think is also important. Sorry, we skipped ahead there, where also, of course, the Orthodox movement, right, not just opposed to Zionism, they were also opposed to the speaking of Hebrew, because this idea arose, and this idea is not a traditional Jewish idea. So I actually do not, sociologically I understand it, religious-wise, it seems harder to reconcile, but that Hebrew should not be spoken outside of any religious function. And so that, of course, still, a lot of these things that we're talking about are true for the late 1800s and early 1900s. They're still true today. And so if you are in the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel, if you are walking through Mea Sharim, which is an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood of Jerusalem, or Bnei Barak, right, which is a city near Tel Aviv that's predominantly ultra-Orthodox, the language you hear on the streets is not Hebrew, it's Yiddish. And so you have, right, and this is almost incredible, because when they go into the Beit Midrash and they study rabbinic texts, 80% of that is Hebrew, right, albeit biblical or rabbinic Hebrew. But then when they go out on the streets and they're hanging out and playing and going to work and all of those things, it's Yiddish, because they believe, right, they took a stance here that Hebrew should not be revived. Okay, so going down a little bit before, somebody else wrote in the chat that the Mizrahim didn't know Yiddish either, which is an important point. We were actually chatting a little bit before this started, where Zionism started off as a very Ashkenazi movement. And we'll hopefully either later today, depending on the time, or next week, get into a little bit of, right, one of the sort of black boxes of early Zionism was its failure to take into account what Jews who weren't Ashkenazi necessarily needed. We'll hopefully get into that soon. Just to go over one or two more approaches, just because, again, this is both historically important to understand the diversity of Jewish intellectualism around Zionism in the late 1800s, and then also for anybody that wants a deeper understanding of modern day Israel, these debates are all as fundamental as understanding, Democrats and Republicans to understanding American politics. We get another view of Zionism in the early 1900s that becomes known as revisionist Zionism. And revisionist Zionism is headed by a man named Zev Jabotinsky. And what Jabotinsky starts to argue, and this is already a little bit later into the 1900s, and so I'm skipping over a little bit of history that we'll return to later just to keep it on the ideological paradigm just for a moment. But Zev Jabotinsky is looking at political Zionists who are mostly, again, secular, disconnected from Jewish tradition. They're very socialist leaning. And he basically starts writing these books and manifestos about, I think we might be doing this wrong, right? And he's not necessarily against the conclusions of what political Zionism is doing, but he just wants to take it further. And so he starts writing about a romantic view, right? One of the reasons why it's called revisionism is because it is a different formulation of Jewish history than the earlier Zionists were using. And he says, well, he starts writing about stories in the Hebrew Bible and Tanakh, and starts writing about the Maccabees and all these times in Jewish history of Jewish power, and starts writing about, I think we need to lean into this a little bit more than political Zionism. Because what was happening, we'll get to this a little bit more once we go into the history, but most of the political Zionists were very liberal / progressive. And so they were doing things like they were going to the Ottoman Empire and they were buying land instead of, say, taking land. And once British Mandate Palestine became in charge, right after World War I, they were trying to lobby the British government for permission to create a Jewish state, not doing whatever they can on the ground to make a Jewish state happen. And so Jabotinsky starts a new trend within the Zionist camp that basically says, well, we agree with most of what the political Zionists are doing. They're just not doing it fast enough or far enough or all of this. So he comes on with a much more right-wing message, right? And by right-wing, I just mean anti-socialist, right? The right-left paradigm when applied to Israel doesn't work very well because even the most right-wing person one could imagine on an economic level would be considered left-wing in America. So if you try to, imagine Benjamin Netanyahu, who I guess now is not the most right-wing person in Israel, but if Benjamin Netanyahu moved to America, his economic policy would certainly be in the Democratic camp, probably even what we might consider on the left side of the Democratic camp. But I don't want to get us on a tangent, so I will leave that at that, right? So he comes in with a more right-wing economic message, and we'll discuss this a little bit more next week, but he actually creates a new paramilitary organization. And so I'm going to sideline this a little bit because when we talk about history, we'll talk about the creation of the Haganah, which was the precursor to the IDF, but he goes so far as to now be establishing new institutions. And so you now had political Zionist institutions and schools and governmental institutions and also paramilitaries. And when I say paramilitary, I just mean that before 1948, there was no such thing as the Israeli army because there was no such thing as the state of Israel. And so all Zionist militaries were just, the term paramilitary sounds bad because it sounds like a bunch of guys in a forest, in Colorado somewhere trying to, take over the country. But when I say paramilitary, I just mean, of course, a militia or a group that was not connected to any state at the moment. So the main paramilitary organization founded in the 1920s was called the Haganah, which just means the defense, which is why the IDF is called Israeli Defense Force. And the revisionist Zionist camp thought that the Haganah was not doing enough. We'll discuss next week what doing enough means, but they established their own military. So this is, again, a major dispute within the Zionist party. And eventually, right, just some names that people might be familiar with, his student or pupil, Menachem Begin, ends up being the founder of the Likud party that took power in Israel politically in the 1970s and has basically held on to power since, of course, a couple of years where they haven't. But just to backstep this, and then we'll move on without getting too stuck in modern history. For the first, again, 25 or so years of Israel's existence, Israel was a political Zionist-driven country. And by that, I mean its original atheistic, socialist, left-wing leanings was the dominant political discourse, and the political power in Israel was all amongst this more socialist, left, atheistic party, right? What we now know as Labor. And then in the 70s, that basically pivoted to Likud. And Likud was the party, of course, of Ariel Sharon and is the party of Bibi. And so just to understand, right, how these original ideologies that were from the early 1900s end up creating the wider debate that we have in Israel now, right? This is the origins, the debate between the revisionist camp and the political camp is the origins of, and now when we say the Israeli right and the Israeli left, right, these are the origins. And they were also, in favor of what Zev Jabotinsky deemed Greater Israel. If you look at this nice map on the top right, this is what Greater Israel is, which is a view that is gained from if you take the biblical or certain biblical geographical borders as to what Israel was at the height of Jewish geographical control, that's what it would look like on a map, right? So Syria, Lebanon, some of Iraq, some of Saudi Arabia, some of Egypt, right? And so that is what Zev Jabotinsky, in some of his original writings, was advocating for, that eventually the Jewish state should encompass these borders. So now, even on a modern sense, right, and now there's virtually, no one in the Jewish world worth hearing from that still thinks this is an ideal that Israel should control some of Saudi Arabia. But in terms of obviously border disputes amongst the Israeli public or within Zionism are big disputes, right? If we control Gaza and the Sinai, should we give it back? If we control the Golan Heights, should we give it back? If we control the West Bank, should we give it back? And we can understand, based off of these original foundational principles, if you are more of a political Zionist and you think, well, what's important is that we have political control and safety and all of these things, but land doesn't matter as much, you are probably going to be a lot more willing to give away land for peace. If you are more of a revisionist, right, you might say, no, right, either you can have some political view that actually the way through peace is through power, which is how Likud has acted over the last generation or two, but you can say, no, actually having ownership and control over certain bits of land is actually a foundational value. So again, we can see how these debates, again, spill over into modern time. And just one more worldview here, lest everybody leave this thinking that once Zionism was proposed in the Jewish world, all Zionists immediately thought exactly alike. We get into Rav Kook and religious Zionism. Now, this is, of course, something that as of late has been in the news more, because one of the new parties in Israel is called religious Zionism. When I say religious Zionism here, do not think the modern party in Israel called religious Zionism, but we're introduced to a Hasidic rabbi named Rav Kook. And Rav Kook was a Talmudic savant, right? He grew up in Europe, and he was just one of the geniuses of the Jewish world, right? He was somebody who, knew the Talmud by heart, right? And he basically, in his early years, he could have been the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the academy at basically any school that he wanted in Europe, right? It's almost as if, right, you can imagine a college professor that's so sought after, all they need to do is call a university, and that university, it doesn't matter, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, whatever, the next day they are the head of whatever department they want, right? That was the caliber of Rabbi Rav Kook was. And so one can imagine the shock that happened throughout the Orthodox world when he decided to leave everything in Europe and show up to Jaffa, right, a small port city in either the 19-teens or 1920 that basically had nothing, to become their rabbi. It is almost as if, in this analogy, somebody declines to, teach at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and basically, moves to the woods somewhere and finds, 5 pupils to educate around a campfire. Meaning this just by way of analogy of what Rav Kook was doing when he moved to Israel. But he came onto the scene with a vision, and he had a famous line. And this line sounds a lot better in Hebrew than it does in English because it rhymes. Hayashan yitchadesh v'chadash yitchadesh, right? Yashan is the Hebrew word for the old. So Hayashan yitchadesh is the old shall be made new, v'chadash yitchadesh, and the new shall be made holy. Now, last week, we were introduced to the founder of Orthodox Judaism, a man named Moshe Schreiber, or the Khatam Sofer, that had a famous mantra himself, which was Chadash Asur Min HaTorah. Anything new is forbidden by the Torah. Rav Kook, coming out of the ultra-Orthodox community, is now talking about, actually, it's not just that the new is not forbidden. The new is actually something that can be made holy. And Rav Kook comes up with this powerful worldview where politics and Zionism becomes a vehicle for religious ends, right? It's why it's called religious Zionism. And what he does, which is fascinating. So we'll read a short quote by him, and then we could discuss these different ideologies, and maybe we probably won't get into any of the actual history this week, so we can pocket that for next week. So he writes as follows: secular Zionists may think they do it for political, national, or socialist reasons. And so, right, he does, he basically acknowledges secular Zionists and what's happening. He says, but in fact, the actual reason for them coming to resettle in Israel is a religious Jewish spark in their soul planted by God. Without their knowledge, they are contributing to the divine scheme and actually creating a great mitzvah. The role of religious Zionists is to help them establish a Jewish state and turn the religious spark in them into a great light. They should show them that the real source of Zionism and the longed for Zion is Judaism, and teach them Torah with love and kindness. In the end, they will understand that the laws of Torah are the key to true harmony and a state that will be a light for the nations and bring salvation to the world. So Rav Kook, again, pictured here in the top right, does something incredible, right? He takes the Orthodox view, which is Zionism is a departure from Judaism. Zionism is bad. Zionism is the anti-Judaism. And because it is being led by predominantly secular Jews, and he says, guys, you're reading the situation wrong. your theology and your history is all messed up. You can actually have both. You can acknowledge that perhaps the way that God works is not through one day you wake up and there is a new temple at the top of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Perhaps God works through human ways, right? There's that bad joke about the person who's stuck in a hurricane, and so he's at the top of his roof and the floodwaters are coming up, and he's praying to God, God, please save me. And a helicopter comes and says, you know, I'm here with the Coast Guard, I'm here to rescue you. And the guy says, no, I'm waiting for God. And then a boat drives by and, you know, I'm here to rescue you. No, I'm waiting for God. And this happens a few more times. And the guy, of course, drowns and goes to heaven and says, God, why didn't you save me? And God says, what do you mean? I sent a helicopter, I sent a boat, right? You just didn't get on. So in a sense, this is how Rav Kook is deciding to understand the secular return to Zion. He's saying that, yes, we actually, as Orthodox Jews, need to acknowledge that redemption is a slow process and not an overnight process. And so he starts what now is, you know, commonplace in the religious Zionist community, that Zionism is what he called Reshat Smichat Geulatenu, right? The beginning of the flowering of our redemption, where he basically says Zionism is the redemption. So we are in the Messianic era. It's just the Messianic era takes a little bit longer than we might have thought, right? Back to this example before, if we land in our 1600s Polish village or Moroccan village, and we say in 2023, we're going to have the state of Israel, but the Messiah hasn't come, Rav Kook would formulate it a little bit differently. The Messiah is coming, right? We are in the Messianic age, and that's why we are back in Israel. It just hasn't been completed yet. And so what religious Zionism does is it makes politics into a holy act, right? Now, of course, this can very quickly have negative repercussions, right? Right, how everyone wants to view modern situations in Israel, right? One could understand that if this is your view, right, there is a mixing of religion and politics in a way that one can be religiously inspirational, on the other hand, can be very dangerous. But Rav Kook starts this worldview, and what he does essentially is he koshers Zionism for the Orthodox community. Now, this doesn't mean that all Orthodox Jews are Zionists in the classical sense, right? There's still the plurality of the Orthodox world today, even the ones who live in Israel, would identify not as Zionists, right? But in the Orthodox community today, especially in the more modern communities, right? Let's say modern Orthodoxy, or in Israel, right? If you're a little bit more modern than ultra-Orthodox, Zionism is not only accepted, Zionism has become a religious ideal. And this is, of course, due to the work of Rav Kook, and is, again, still one of the fastest growing movements in Israel. Just to unshare my screen and just to go over a brief overview here, and then, of course, happy to take any questions, comments, complaints, all of that. So we were mostly in the realm of ideas today, which I think is important. And, you know, there wasn't as much history as so much as historiography to some extent, or history of ideas here. But we're introduced to now a new potential solution to the Jewish question, and one in which we have been involved in for the past 120 years, since really the outset of modern Zionism. And what we see now is a twofold debate that we discussed today, which is, in the Jewish world, one, is Zionism, in whatever conception that you want to form it, a good idea or bad idea, or should we accept it, should we not accept it? And two, if we do accept it, what Zionism? How should Zionism be configured? What does it even mean to be a Zionist? And this is, of course, also a question still in the Jewish world. So we saw a number of answers. We saw Herzl Zionism, we saw the ultra-Orthodox critique of Zionism, we saw the liberal progressive critique of Zionism, we saw Achad Ha'am's reformulation of the Jewish question, we saw revisionist Zionism, which we'll talk about a little bit more next week as we talk about once things actually start happening and Jews start moving to Israel, and of course, what we know to be the Israeli-Arab or Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We'll get into all that next week. And then I think the week after, we'll re-go over American history there. Thank you all. Again, I'm here. Any comments, questions, thoughts, all of that.
Hi, it's Marcia.
Hey, how's it going?
My second outrageously good class with you today, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Thank you. That was such a great beginning to this incredibly complicated and important piece of where we are today and it unfolding. And so I just wanted to let everyone know how, just want to reaffirm how lucky we are to be able to learn with Daniel and to let you know that for those of you who may or may not know, the collaborative, which is, co-host.
Oh, no, you're good, Ava. Go for it. And then we'll do Robert after.
Okay. Without Zionism, there would be no Israel. And I am just wondering which Zionism created this incredible country that has developed technology, that has won Nobel Prizes, that has shown the world incredible achievement. It's not which segment of the Israeli society created that?
That
It's a
is
great
a
question.
fabulous question, Eva. Wow.
I don't know if this is a cop-out, but I truly mean what I'm about to say. It's all of them. And that's more controversial of an answer than you might want, because it might have been, again, guessing is always, a dumb game to some extent, but I'll guess anyway. It might have been that if it wasn't for, let's say, revisionist Zionism, it might have been that the state never would have formed, right? Because maybe, again, this might, people can object on all sides to what I'm about to say, and I'm not even sure I'm right. The revisionist Zionist camp basically came in with increased pressure, both mostly against Britain, right? One of the problems that happened, we'll discuss this a little bit more next week, but Britain passes the Balfour Declaration, where they basically promise there eventually will be a Jewish state. We'll discuss this in depth next week, but then they basically don't act on it. And not only do they not act on it based off of pressure from the local Arab community, which is getting increasingly upset that from their view, all these foreigners are showing up and taking their land, Britain starts passing these increasingly strict white papers where they're limiting Jewish migration. They are increasingly limiting Jewish migration once the Holocaust starts, right? In 1939, they passed the harshest white paper where they only allow about 10 or 15,000 Jews a year into Palestine. And when millions of people are getting killed, right, 15,000 is nothing. And so the political Zionist camp is very tiptoeing around the British government and still trying to act through political means. And the revisionist Zionist camp is engaging in what one might call acts of terrorism against the British government, right? The most infamous example is blowing up the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. So was that morally good? Was that morally bad? Again, that's a question that I don't feel like I am morally accomplished enough to answer, because I have no idea. And, if Israel would not have been formed without that, maybe the ends justify the means. All that is to say, they were all important, because if it wasn't for Herzl, this idea never would have gotten out. Maybe if it wasn't for the more right wing, the idea never would have been pushed more. Maybe if it wasn't for Echad Ha'am, Israel would have been so secular that the rest of the Jewish world never would have funded it to the extent that it did. I mean, the American Jewish community in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, while most American Jews obviously didn't move to Israel, which is why there are so many of us in America today, they sure funded it. And so maybe if it wasn't for Echad Ha'am, right, that wouldn't have happened, right? It's a lot more exciting to be a part of the project to rebuild the Jewish national homeland with Jewish symbols than it is to build a bunch of Jews who want to live in Uganda with their own government, right? So that is to say, sort of all of that, which is already controversial, because what that means is that it's almost a worldview, which I think I adopt anyway, which is having political balance is good. And so sometimes it's good to have a more right wing and sometimes good to have more left wing, and especially when they balance themselves out. Anybody on more of the right or the left will immediately say I'm wrong for X, Y, and Z reasons.
And I would just like to augment that a little bit, Eva, which is that it not only, again, is it the cocktail of all of them in some measure, but it's also all the waves of immigration subsequent to the founding of the state that have really, added and brought such incredible talent that allowed, like the tech industry to flourish and stuff. And that probably includes some of the Russian immigration of the 90s and that kind of thing. So just putting that out there as another piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, great question. Robert, did you have a comment?
Well, actually, I was just thinking about discussions I had with someone else, saying with the increase of the right wing in Israel, the religious right, I have a bad feeling this is going to curtail the technical advancements in Israel, because they restrict their schools where they don't teach that stuff. And I think that's a problem.
Yeah, there's sort of two different problems, if I'm hearing you correctly. There's one, in the ultra-Orthodox community, that the problem is education, where by some demographic prediction in the future, the future of Israel is going to look more and more ultra-Orthodox, and they're against education. And so how do you have a 21st century technological powerhouse when, let's say, 40% of your country refuses to learn any language but Yiddish and study things that aren't Talmud, right? That's a question, and a pretty big question. The second is what's happened in the last 2 months with the proposed judiciary overhaul, which is also, whatever one thinks of it, it is economically hurting Israel, because both Israeli investors are moving their investments abroad, and also the international community is less willing to invest in Israel because they are perceiving Israel as being, a weaker democracy. And by weaker democracy, I just mean, things aren't as safe in terms of investments and checks and balances. And so I agree with you on both accounts.
Yeah, no, I've heard from somewhere that the secular Jews in Israel are having like 2 children, and the religious are having 7. And that's going to cause a change just in itself.
Right.
Yeah. Although it is interesting to say that out of all Western countries and all liberal democratic countries, Israel, even if you discount the ultra-Orthodox and also the Arab populations of Israel, Israel still has the highest birth rate. I think it's like 2.1 or 2.2 for secular Israelis. And, in America, it's lower, Japan, it's lower, Europe, it's lower. So, but you're right. I mean, I was actually just talking about this today with a friend of mine. There's one view that's very pessimistic about demographics of Israel, and then another view that basically says, it's impossible to predict anything based off of demographics, because who knows how worldviews change over the years and all of that. But it is definitely something people are looking out for in terms of the future of Israel is demographic shifts.
And also, I will just add, when there's a drastic change, there are always consequences and byproducts, which is very interesting. And if in fact the change is such that really orthodoxy rules the day and is the dominant sort of theology and the ways that they're trying to build fences around themselves, if that does become, the operative, I guess, the MO of Israel, they're going to have to start defending themselves. There just will not be enough other people to protect them. And one thing I can tell you, even though I'm only 61, is that everybody will always hate the Jews. I don't know if it's good or bad, but Israel's always in danger, and somebody's going to have to protect it. And it might be the Orthodox, and who knows what sort of long range impacts that could have. We may not be alive to see it. I'm just putting that out there. We just don't know.
I think some of the old Orthodox do not feel their young men should serve in the army, especially the women. And that would reduce the pool of military recruits.
Yeah. Well, it's connected. I mean, that is a direct offshoot of what we're talking about today, where, I mean, this is very counterintuitive, I think, for the wider international community to understand, but the ultra-Orthodox community, even though many of them are living in Israel, are not in favor of Zionism. And what that ends up meaning practically is not that they're not living there. It's not that they're not going to take, welfare from the state if they need it, because they do, but it's that they are against any type of public service, unless it benefits them. I mean, I have sort of a very pessimistic view of the ultra-Orthodox community, so I will apologize for that outright, but they'll of course vote when it's important to vote because you want to get your politicians in. And of course you'll take welfare from the state because, you need food, and, you're of course going to drive on the roads because those are important. And if your house is burning down, you'll call the fire department, and Israel has socialized medicine. So if you get sick, you're more than happy that the secular doctor with secular books is treating you. But then all of a sudden, when it comes time to go to the army, oh no, we don't believe in the state. We're not going to do it. Again, I have a very, I won't hide my bias here, but yes, it's a problem.
Yeah. Later on, will it be possible to download all the recordings?
Yeah, 100%.
Thank you.
Robert, you can, when you say all the recordings, are you talking about all the past classes, including this one?
Yes.
They're available on the Jewish Collaborative of Orange County website in total. And if you go, you go on our website, and I included a link that can find you that. And if you go to adult education and you click on pathways, but Daniel has all of them, and he can send them to you actually if you'd like. But you can find
I appreciate that very much, because I've missed a couple. I'm going to be like next week, I'm going to be on the road back east, and my
Yeah, of course.
time's, I'm going to be in Indiana.